This semester, we've been looking at decisions that customers and businesses make, right? We looked at where the demand curve comes from and where the supply curve comes from and how that determines the price in the market. Well, all of that we've been looking at so far is really based on a perfectly competitive market. But perfectly competitive markets don't work perfectly. There are market failures that cause us to need government intervention. And that's why at the beginning of the semester, we talked about how we're not in a competitive economy. We're a bit of a hybrid between a competitive economy and a command economy. We also need to look at what happens if you are not in a perfectly competitive market. What if you have less competition, like with monopolies and oligopolies, or where you're able to differentiate yourself like monopolistic competition. So these are the topics that we have left this semester to cover. We need to kind of take all the things that we've learned and tie them all together to understand the perfectly competitive market. That'll be our baseline or comparison to compare reality and the need for some government involvement, so our market failures, but also to compare it to less competitive markets like monopolies and oligopolies. So that's where we have still yet to go. So what we need to do first is understand the different types of markets. So a market is anything that brings a buyer and seller together. So we've talked about markets already as Kijiji, eBay, the grocery store, the gas station, the mall, farmer's market. Buyers and sellers come together and negotiate the sell or exchange of a product, so price and quantity. Well, there are different types of markets. So we're going to look right now at the different types of markets. And when we look at the different types of markets, we want to identify is the market power. So market power is the ability of a firm or consumer to alter the market price. So who has the power or influence over the price? So what we've been looking at so far are perfectly competitive markets. In perfectly competitive markets, no individual company or person has market power. Everyone is a price taker. The price is set by supply and demand. So a perfectly competitive market, no individual company or individual person, consumer, has market power. Everyone's a price taker. They take the price that's determined by the market, supply and demand. That is not true for these other types of markets. The other types of markets we're going to look at, one entity has more market power or more influence over price. So let's look at these different types of markets. We have monopolistic competition, monopolies, undifferentiated oligopolies, and differentiated oligopolies. There is also one more type of market we're just going to discuss briefly, and that is what is called a monopsony. And this is not in the textbook, but just an interesting thing to know. Whereas the oligopolies and monopolies are about having a small number of sellers, a monopsony is when you have a single buyer. Okay, so the monopsony is going to shift the market power to the consumer, whereas monopolies, one seller, or oligopolies, just a handful of sellers, the market power is with the business. Well, why does market power matter? Whoever has influence over the price is going to pick a price that is more beneficial to them. So a monopoly has no competitors. You have no choice who else to buy from. So because of that, the monopoly is able to charge a higher price. So if the businesses have more market power, more influence over price, the price is going to be what? Higher or lower? It's going to be higher. Same thing with oligopolies. You only have a handful of competitors, then there's less choice for the consumer, and the power over the price rests with the business. The prices are going to be higher than they are in the perfectly competitive market. Remember, this price in the perfectly competitive market maximize the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. So that price made it the best deal for everyone. When you start to have market power that is rested with the business, then that price goes up and eats into that consumer surplus. In comparison, a monopsony, where you have one buyer, then the market power is with the customer. So you have lots of businesses trying to sell and one buyer. So an example of a monopsony is pharmaceuticals in Canada. So our government is the single buyer. They buy and negotiate the price for drugs on behalf of, provincially, because our healthcare is at a provincial level. They negotiate a price for drugs at the provincial level. So one buyer, a number of companies, pharmaceutical companies that sell drugs. So who has the market power? The handful of sellers, the one buyer. Well, the one buyer has the market power, the power over price. So what does that do to the price of drugs? It makes the drug prices go down. So here the power is with the customer. It can eat into the producer surplus. If you compare that to the US, where you have all these insurance companies negotiating to buy and setting the price of the drugs, and you have all the pharmaceutical companies, now the market power is actually in the hands of the handful of pharmaceutical company versus the hundreds of different insurance companies. So when we look at the price of drugs in Canada versus the US, who has lower prices? Canada has lower prices, and it's because our system is a monopsony, whereas in the US, you have an oligopoly, a handful of sellers, lots of buyers. So the market power shifts to the seller and makes the price go up. So we care about who has the market power and what type of market we're in. It also matters because we have antitrust laws, which we'll talk about in a subsequent video. So just recently, the US Congress announced that they did an investigation, and Google and Amazon and Apple, they're accusing them of wielding monopoly power. Okay, well, monopoly. Well, what do they mean by monopoly power? They mean the power to influence the market price. They mean market power. And while monopolies themselves are not necessarily problematic, we allow for monopolies, the concern about monopoly power is having too much influence over the price. And so what matters is how much competition there is, because that determines the market power, because how much do customers have in terms of choice to go somewhere else if a company is charging too much. So it's important to identify the type of market so we can look at, is there undue or too much influence, too much market power in the hands of certain individuals or companies? So we need to better understand these different types of markets. So let's dive in more detail. We said before, in a perfectly competitive market, there are lots of buyers and lots of sellers. Okay, in a perfectly competitive market, you got thousands of buyers and thousands of sellers, and no one individual has the ability to influence the price. The price is set by supply and demand, and everybody is a price taker. And that's because you're so small compared to everybody else that if you charge too much, everyone will switch to the other competitors. Okay. A monopoly is where you have one supplier. Okay. An oligopoly is where you have a handful. So the general rule of thumb is that if you can count on your fingers the number of sellers, then you have an oligopoly. So let's look at some examples of these different types of markets. So When it comes to perfectly competitive markets, it's hard to find a truly perfectly competitive market where every buyer and every seller is so small and the things that are being sold are identical, so there's no preference as to what company you buy from or what customer you sell to. That's kind of the benchmark we compare everything else to. The closest we can get to these perfectly competitive markets tend to be commodities. So things like wheat and fish, other vegetables and crops tend to be the closest we get to perfect competition. Lots of small sellers like farmers and ranchers, lots of individual buyers. So things on stock exchanges, you can think there's lots of buyers, lots of sellers, that kind of scenario. Another example of perfect competition would be Uber. Now, Uber itself as a company, right? There's only a couple competitors, Lyft, things like that. So the company itself and getting ride service isn't necessarily the perfectly competitive market. But if you think about how the price is set for an individual driver for Uber, there are thousands of Uber drivers, not in Red Deer. I think there's like 3 last time I checked. But in other cities, bigger cities, there's thousands of Uber drivers. There's thousands of riders. And the price of a trip with Uber is based on how many drivers are available and how many people need a ride. So then it acts more like a perfectly competitive market. And perhaps you've heard about Uber's surge pricing. So the idea here is that during peak periods of time when lots of people want to ride, demand goes up, and that demand, right? We know an increase in demand causes the price to go up. So that surge pricing is a higher price per mile or kilometer because of the increase in demand. So here we have, in terms of the pay per kilometer or mile, the pay per Uber driver acts more like the perfectly competitive market. Lots of riders, lots of drivers, and the price you pay is dependent on the demand and supply and that equilibrium. So those are some examples of that perfectly competitive market. No individual buyer or seller sets the price. The price is set by supply and demand. Everybody is a price taker. Monopolistic competition, in comparison, has lots of buyers and lots of sellers. The difference is that the sellers have a way to differentiate themselves. So in a perfectly competitive market, you don't care who you buy from. So assuming you don't care which Uber driver you have, or you don't care which farmer produced the wheat, you're buying simply based on price. In monopolistically competitive markets, there's brand loyalty. You care about which business you're buying from. So an example of monopolistically competitive market would be restaurants, right? There's a certain type of food you like, a certain restaurant you like. Maybe it's because of the food they serve. Maybe it's the ambiance or environment. Maybe it's the location. Maybe you like Earl's, for example, because they have a great patio in the summer. So you show brand loyalty. And if you're able to differentiate your product from the competition, so you offer a different type of food, so maybe you're the new tequila bar, you offer tequila and no one else does, then who has the market power? Well, even though you have lots of competitors, lots of other restaurants to go to, because you as the customer have loyalty, you are giving your market power to the business. And it allows the business to charge a little bit more because you'll keep coming back, not based on the price, but because they offer something different. Tequila, outdoor patio, things like that. Convenience stores, for example. If you think about the price of milk, how does the price of milk at the corner store compare to the price of milk at the grocery store? Who charges more? The corner store. Why? Why? Because you are paying for convenience. You're willing to pay a little bit more for the milk and only have to go a block instead of the other end of town and walk all the way to the back of the grocery store, right? So they're able to differentiate themselves by proximity, by being close to you. And by being a little bit different, because they're close and the grocery store is not, the market power is given to the business, and the business then is able to charge a bit higher price. Differentiated oligopolies are where you have a handful of sellers. So monopolistic competition, lots of sellers, but they're different. Differentiated oligopoly is a handful of sellers, and they're different. So for example, you're driving down the highway, you see a car in front of you. Can you tell who made it? Sure, they look different. They have their logo slapped all over it. So we can tell which car was made by which company. Well, why would the car companies want their cars to look different? So that when you're driving down the highway and you see a car that looks nice, you say, hey, I want that one. And you know exactly where to go to get it. So now you're showing brand loyalty, right? You want a particular design, you want particular features, you want to buy from a particular company. Well, as soon as you start showing that loyalty, who has the market power? You're no longer buying based on whichever one is the cheapest. You're now buying based on features. And so the business can then charge more. So automobile companies, cigarettes, these type of companies have differentiated oligopolies. Undifferentiated oligopolies are where you have a handful of sellers, but we can't tell them apart. So if we look at lumber, can you tell which lumber mill did the cutting? If you have a barrel of oil, okay, unrefined oil, can you tell who pulled it out of the ground? Okay. So if you cannot tell who made it, they look the same, then who are you going to buy from? You're going to buy based on price. So the undifferentiated part, the part where we can't tell them apart, is going to put more of the market power to the customer because now they're buying based on price. However, if you only have a handful of sellers, then that's going to put more of the market power to the business, and they're going to charge more because you have less choice on who you buy from. So who's going to have higher prices? Differentiated oligopolies or undifferentiated oligopolies? Differentiated oligopolies will have higher prices. Who's going to have a higher price? Undifferentiated oligopolies or perfect competition? In both of those, you can't tell the goods apart. The difference is perfect competition has lots of sellers. Undifferentiated oligopoly has a handful. Well, in an undifferentiated oligopoly, you have less choice as to who you're going to buy from, so its prices will be higher than perfect competition. So you can see why we start to look at the different types of markets, because it's going to tell us who has the market power and what's happening with prices. All right, let's look at the last market here, which is monopolies. Monopolies, one seller. So if we're looking at laying cable in Red Deer, there's only one company that put down cable. Okay, one company to choose from. When it comes to public utilities, these tend to be monopolies. One company who provides the infrastructure. So then who has the market power? Lots of buyers, one seller. Well, if you don't like the price that's being charged by the monopoly, do you have anywhere else to go? No. So the market power rests with the monopoly, and monopolies will have the highest prices of all these different types of markets. So perfectly competitive markets will have the lowest price because we're buying solely based on price and you have lots of companies to choose from. Monopolies will have the highest price because you don't have any choice. There are no alternatives. There's only one company to buy from. So we can actually put this out into a table based on the number of companies and whether we can tell the goods apart. So take a quick moment, pause this video, and see if you can identify which box belongs to monopoly, monopolistic competition, perfect competition, undifferentiated oligopolies, and differentiated oligopolies. All right, let's start with an easy one. One firm. Well, you can't really compare the one company to anything. So we have a monopoly. What if we have a handful, a few? Can you tell the goods apart? Well, if you have a handful of companies, you have an oligopoly. And if you can tell the goods apart, you have a differentiated oligopoly. If you have a handful of companies that are providing the product, you have an oligopoly. If you can't tell the goods apart, it is undifferentiated. If you have lots of firms, but they are different, slightly different, like the restaurants, then what do we have? What kind of market is that? That is a monopolistic competition. So highly competitive, lots of places that people can choose to eat, but because we differentiate, we create that brand or customer loyalty, we create preference for our company, that then starts to give the company monopoly type powers. So that's why we call it monopolistic competition. And then if you have many companies, they all provide the same product. That's why we tend to think of commodities as many firms, identical product. You buy from whomever's the cheapest. This is the perfectly competitive market. Over the next couple videos, we're going to be looking at these different types of markets and looking at what does it mean to be a perfectly competitive market. What are the characteristics? What is the impact? And we're going to look at oligopolies and monopolistic competition and monopolies, oligopolies and monopolistic competition. What are the characteristics of these markets and what are the implications on customers and businesses of being in this type of market?